Hello everyone, once again, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the theme COVID-19, what outcome for power projects in Africa. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges. I am a senior journalist with BBC Africa. This webinar is the fourth in a series of 6 dedicated to business leaders operating in Africa around the consequences of COVID-19, and it is organized by the Africa CEO Forum in partnership with the international law firm Acfta & Co. So before starting our discussion, I just have a few practical information and I ask you to please pay attention. So please bear in mind that you can ask questions and comment in writing. And to this effect, there is a tab at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. Please, I invite you to use that as much as possible because your opinions are very important to us. And it is a great way for you to contribute to what is being said. Your opinion, as I said, is very essential. And also, so there will be 2 surveys during our webinar today, and I will give you the questions and a few minutes later, the answers as well. So there again, I encourage you to take part. And finally, please use the hashtag ACF Digital Events on social media. It is, again, a great interactive way to contribute to our discussion today. Ladies and gentlemen, over the last decade, as you know, the installed capacity in Africa has increased a staggering, an average of 10 gigawatts per year. But as you also know, this trend is in jeopardy due to the onset of COVID-19. And today we aim to look at the extent of these disruptions. We'll namely take a look at the impact of this health crisis on current power projects, whether electrification is still a priority for African governments, and finally, whether renewables will emerge stronger from this crisis. And to discuss, I have the pleasure today to introduce Damilola Ogunbiyi. Mrs. Ogunbiyi is CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All, and she is also co-chair of UN Energy. We'll also be in the company of Owen Omogiafo, who's President Chief Executive Officer of Transnational Corporation of Nigeria PLC, as well as with Homa P, CIO of African Infrastructure Investment Managers, Simon Ratledge, partner at Acfta & Co. We'll also have the insights of 2 very special guests during this webinar, and they are Yassine Keroumi, International Sales Director at Fonroche Lighting, and Duncan Williams, Senior Counsel at Acfta & Co. But first, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Haruperi Mumbegegui, Legal Counsel in the power sector at the African Legal Support Facility. Prior to this role, Mrs. Mumbegegui worked at a leading law firm in Beijing, China, where she practiced as a corporate lawyer advising clients on a number of power and infrastructure-related projects. I leave the floor to you, Mrs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Anne-Marie. A very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Haruperi Mumbegegui, and I'll be setting the scene for us this afternoon. COVID-19 crisis, what outcome for power projects in Africa? As you'll see on my next slide, the facts are clear. Africa has a very well-documented energy deficit. Over 640 million people do not have access to electricity on our continent. That's about half the continent's population. However, there are a number of initiatives that are designed to address this. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7 aims to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. And the African Development Bank's High Five aims to light up and power Africa. However, to achieve universal access to energy by 2030 requires over 160 gigawatts of new capacity to be installed. And as you can imagine, this requires a mammoth investment of up to $70 billion per year. However, in the advent of renewable energy, we've seen the costs of renewable energy technologies, such as solar PV, come down dramatically over the last several years. And this figure could actually be cut in half if we optimize the use of renewables. Furthermore, there are about 447 documented projects in the pipeline to 2023. However, the harsh reality is many of these projects might not actually see it through to financial close. On my next slide, we're going to look at Africa's energy mix. Something that's going to come out from this panel is, will the energy mix change in the post-COVID times? Now, the reality is that Africa is not yet using as much renewable as there is potential on this continent. Most of our energy consumption is natural gas and coal, with 66 gigawatts and 49 gigawatts respectively. We have massive hydro potential in some parts of the continent, and that's led to 36 gigawatts of installed capacity in hydro. But you'll notice that wind and solar are lagging behind, with 3.2 gigawatts and 5 gigawatts installed respectively. Now, the reality of these figures, though, is that they're contextual by country. In North Africa, for example, there's been a huge initiative to maximize the use of renewables. Morocco, for example, sees 36% of its installed capacity as renewable energy on the grid. Looking at the graph on the left-hand side, however, you'll notice that between 2010 and 2020, there's been a massive rise in the use of renewable energies, and we look forward to seeing that rise even more. Now, on the next slide, we're going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the power sector. The impacts can be felt in 3 different levels: international, national, and project specific. Internationally, there's been a massive disruption in the global supply chain. For example, 80% of the solar PV panels used on this continent come from China. China was one of the first countries to undergo massive national lockdown. And the outcome of this has been a massive delay in the shipping of materials for projects that are at construction stage. Now, travel bans and quarantine periods, I think, is something that all of us can relate to, whereby experts and key personnel have been unable to travel to implement projects. On a national level, this is different from country to country, as there have been different levels of lockdowns, ranging from a full, complete national lockdown to no lockdown at all, or partial or regional lockdowns. However, one constant has been the reduction in energy sales and collections by utilities. However, what has remained unchanged is the payment obligations of the utilities, and in some instances, they're actually higher. We've also seen some delays in procurement processes. Now, project-specific impacts include the curtailment of energy production, and this is also a product of the reduced demand for power due to national lockdowns. We're also expecting to see some disputes arise out of force majeure and change in law clauses. And we also see massive construction delays, which ordinarily would lead to liquidated damages. But these delays are a product of this COVID-19 crisis and linked back to the international impact of COVID. Let's go into detail in the next slide. When we speak of a drop in demand and collections, it's important to note that for most utilities, their biggest clients are actually industrial and commercial producers. Now, in countries where there's been a complete lockdown, it means that there's no longer this massive demand for energy, and therefore the utilities are collecting much less from their customers. Now, if we look at delays and uncertainty in competitive procurement processes, I'll give an example. In Eswatini, we supported the launch of a competitive procurement process for solar PV. However, the lockdown happened, and we had to be very innovative in the manner in which we held a bidders conference online, virtually, for all the pre-selected bidders, in order to ensure that there's no uncertainty as to whether the procurement process will continue. And we also delayed the process and timeline by 2 months. In Seychelles, where we are supporting Africa's first ever utility scale floating solar PV plant, the conditional award was given to a preferred bidder. However, the unconditional award, the final effective award, was delayed by 2 months in order to give all the stakeholders room to deal with the current crisis. The issuance of force majeure notices is also something that was very topical in the end of February and early March in South Africa, whereby the utility issued force majeure notices to major producers, major IPPs, independent power producers. However, it was interesting to note that some developers sat up and said, hang on, is this not a change in law instead? Because the set of remedies available in terms of a power purchase agreement are completely different. And I'll be very interested to hear from the legal experts on this panel how this kind of dispute is going to play out in post-COVID times. Local currency depreciation is also another major issue that's going to arise. And this is because we all know that the global economy is in a massive flux right now. And some local currencies are going to be harder hit than others. Unfortunately, most utilities and projects collect their revenues in local currency. However, the debts are denominated in hard currency, and these obligations remain. And now this disconnect is going to affect the financial sustainability of certain power projects across the continent, as well as the financial stability of the national utilities. And this affects bankability at large. Now, another important point is the reallocation of resources to the health sector. The impact of COVID-19 can be felt immediately in the health sector, and we've seen massive mobilization of resources for the health sector. However, it's an intricate balancing act to ensure that all sectors, including the power sector, receive the required financial support and resources to ensure that we meet our 2030 objective. Now, on the next slide, we have a critical question, and I hope the answer to this question comes out on the panel today. In the midst of this COVID crisis, are we going to see the crisis emerge as a catalyst for addressing Africa's power deficit? For example, will we be able to address our energy resilience by shifting towards renewable energies instead of fossil fuels? Balance. How are we going to balance the competing interests and needs for resources? And how is this going to affect the power sector and the health sector to ensure that all sectors receive the same amount of resources required to fight this crisis? Preparation. Now, this is an important one. How do we prepare for expeditious dispute resolution to ensure that we don't have important projects tied up in international arbitration for years to come? And lastly, support. Support is essential. The financial health of utilities is the key to bankability. And if we don't support our utilities, we'll find it very difficult to have credit-worthy utilities that are able to offtake from the projects that are going to be developed in the near future. In conclusion, I leave you with a quote from Einstein. In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists this afternoon. Where does the opportunity lie in this crisis? Perhaps it's time for us to stop viewing COVID-19 as a crisis, but viewing it as an opportunity to expedite powering Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bungegewi, for this wonderful insight and also for asking the questions which, as you say, I hope that, and we should be able to answer today, whether this crisis can be seen as an opportunity and a catalyst. I really like that term, LESI, and certainly we'll be talking about renewables as well in the last part of our discussion. So thank you once again for raising those very important points.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. And before moving ahead, I would like you to take a closer look at your screen. You will see in a second the first question for our survey today. Do you fear that the pace of electric projects in Africa could be lastingly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis? Please take a second to answer, and in a few minutes, I'll give you the answer to this, the results of this first survey. Also, I want to remind you to use the official hashtag on social media, hashtag ACF Digital Events, and thus, taking our conversation to social media. And now to our panel, which I have the pleasure to introduce at greater length. We are in the company of Damilola Ogunbiyi, CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All, and also co-chair of UN Energy. Mrs. Ogunbiyi is also Commissioner for the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty. Mrs. Ogunbiyi, please be welcome. We also are with Mrs. Owen Omogiafo, President Chief Executive Officer of Transnational Corporation of Nigeria PLC, a diversified conglomerate with strategic investment in power, hospitality, and oil and gas sectors. She also has 2 decades of corporate experience. Be welcome, please, Mrs. Omogiafo. Roman P, CIO at African Infrastructure Investment Managers. Mr. P has 20 years experience in infrastructure with a proven track record in originating, structuring, and executing investments in developed and also emerging markets. Mr. P is also leading AIIM Pan-African Fund business and represents the company as a director on the board of a number of illustrious companies. Mr. P, be welcome also. And finally, we are with Simon Ratledge, partner at Asafo & Co., where he specializes in energy and infrastructure project finance and project development. Mr. Ratledge is an expert in thermal and renewable power, infrastructure, mining, petrochemicals, and oil and gas projects across Anglophone, but also Francophone Africa, as we'll see in a few seconds. So first, let's take a look at how this health crisis has impacted the current power projects in Africa. And I would like to turn to you first, Mrs. Omogiafo, to ask you, well, Transcorp Nigeria is quite an important player in the power business, and you are indeed deepening your stake in the power generation space. You have indeed acquired the Ughelli power plant, that's in the Delta State in Nigeria back in 2013, and you have also been selected as the preferred bidder in the middle of last year for the Afam power plant. But this last acquisition has not yet been closed, so I would like to ask you whether you can tell us how the crisis has impacted these various projects, please.
So thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and a good afternoon to everyone. It's great that we're here discussing these very topical issues. COVID-19 indeed is upon us. What has been said, within every crisis, there is an opportunity. So as you've said, I represent Transnational Corporation of Nigeria, Transcorp, who is a very significant player in the power business in Nigeria. We have the Transcorp Ughelli power plant that has an installed capacity of 972 megawatts. And it should also maybe just point out that a few days ago, the Bureau for Public Enterprises has recognized that the Transcorp power plant achieved the capacity target of 680 megawatts of installed capacity 5 years after takeover. And you should note that when we took over, we had 160 megawatts, and that has taken it up, just in case of talking about existing projects. How it's been affected in the past few months, the role of power has become even more emphasized in the development of our country, Nigeria. So Transcorp as a group, our purpose is to improve lives and transform Nigeria. And how are we going to do this? Power is a very critical lever to doing this. From the schools, the hospitals, the small businesses, large businesses, we rely significantly on power. And that's why as a group, we have our investments in there. So in the Transcorp power plant in Ughelli, we have a gas thermal plant, right? It's situated in the south of Nigeria, and we generate very strongly. So we've gone on last year to emerge as a preferred bidder for Afam 1 to 5, which brings to our power play an additional 966 megawatts. So as you've said, it is a deal that is in the works, and how it has affected it. So there's been a lockdown in Nigeria, which is gradually being released, is gradually being relaxed. And we've been having different discussions around it. How are we going to do the takeover? What are the factors to consider? And it's important to note that the Afam power plant is coming on board with Nigeria's first fast power. So Afam fast power, of which that's going to bring about 240 megawatts of electricity that will be generated, adding to the existing national grid. For us as Transcorp PLC, power continues to be a very strategic and significant sector for us. And if you look at what's going on, there is confidence in the sector, despite all the challenges that we're seeing. Most recently, the World Bank has approved a $750 million funding for the Nigeria Power Sector Recovery Program. These are critical things that are showing that power is very important, and how we're going to achieve it is in there. So we continue to be a key player, and we appreciate the federal government of Nigeria for the additional focus that has been given to the sector during the crisis. When the previous speaker spoke, she talked about the challenges in the sector. She talked about the liquidity. In the past few months, we have seen increased liquidity in the sector, where we've received some payments that have significantly reduced the legacy debt that we have been carrying. So as core investors in power, we remain confident that power is very important to Nigeria. We have over 50 million Nigerians that don't have access to electricity, even till now. So for us, both off-grid and on-grid solutions are critical to our strategic play.
Thank you very much. So confidence, amidst this crisis. I would like to turn to you now, Mr. P. AIIM has numerous projects all over Africa in different countries. And so I would like to ask you whether your assets have suffered in the past 3 months. And since you are operating in various countries, whether the impact is different depending in which country you're operating.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Anne-Marie. I think what we have seen is our portfolio has weathered the crisis well. And we've been very pleased by the resilience of the asset, which are diversified across technology, but also across countries. And I think often there is always this tendency of packing all the countries in one box. And I think often people have forgotten that, save exception, the energy intensity in most of the countries on the continent are pretty low. So what I mean is you don't have big industries or big consumers on that. You've got a much more dispersed range of clients. And what we've seen is a shift from the industrial customers to some extent towards residential and commercial, and not necessarily a massive reduction. Now, that's not the case, for example, of South Africa, which have a larger heavy industries. Now, I think we've been, and we started the crisis, we did expect much more issues and two things happened. The issues happened, some were interesting. We got 2 CEOs stranded in the wrong countries. Legacy of travel ban. We have also some supply chain issue on 2 assets under construction, but nothing really, not to the extent that was presented by the LSF person. We've been able to ship back engine back to Europe and already back in country in Ghana. We got some slight delay in FSIU deliveries, but nothing which is not manageable within the timetable. But more importantly, and I think that's very important, we've seen some very good surprises. And in a similar, as Owen was mentioning, we invested into Ukuo midstream asset in Nigeria, and what we've seen is increased gas deliveries, showing that the power plant and the energy sector is in fact working well. And we've seen a very good performance across the distributed power sectors. So again, in Nigeria, in the CNI space with Starsight, but also in East Africa through our solar system investment into Bbox. Now, I think it's still the early days. And I think we need to be cautious. And I think we've seen in the first presentation, I think on our side, what is keeping us in a sense a bit concerned is in one hand, the lack of stimulus by the government. And at one stage, the customers are going to feel the economic impact of this slowdown. And the second piece is we've seen a significant deterioration of the public finances, and especially a deterioration of the fiscal position, which usually lead to downwards pressure on FX. So we're a bit concerned about this effect over the medium to long term, and that will have on the power sector.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to you, Mrs. Ogunbiyi. Mrs. Ogunbiyi, your organization, Sustainable Energy for All, is focused on developing renewable energy on the continent. So I would like to ask you, what kind of consequences has the crisis had on off-grid projects, whether they are mini-grids to solar home systems, please?
I think the key point is the fact that things were already going bad in energy access even before the crisis. My stats are slightly different. I have about 565 million people without access on the continent now. And the truth of it is that a majority of those people can also be served with decentralized renewable energy. So I do think the role of the utility and large projects plays a key role, but I also think you have to talk about smaller distributed energy. So in terms of our data, we realized on average a loss of revenue between 27% for the solar home system companies and about 40% for the mini grid companies. But also we also recognize that this is actually one of the best times to really change and recover better with sustainable energy for all. So we're quite happy with the support we've been getting in terms of governments coming to us and asking, how do we actually recover better from this? And you can see examples of that in, just in case of my country, Nigeria, removing the fossil fuel subsidy, which would have never been done before, and also actually having it in their economic recovery plan of 5 million solar power connections. So, you know, even when people are saying the challenges, I actually believe that it's a catalyst not to waste a good crisis. And it just shows that when you don't have energy access for people, you really can't keep people in isolation and you can't keep them in lockdown. And if anything, it emphasizes the issue. I think there's been issues with supply chain. But then it also brings an opportunity that why isn't there, apart from maybe South Africa, why isn't there any big assembly or light manufacturing for at least 3 key solar products, inverters, batteries, or solar panels on continent? So for me, it's more of an opportunity, and I'm really optimistic that this pandemic has shown a lot of African countries just what they can do in the long term.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ogunbiyi. So a lot of key words here, which are quite surprising. Maybe when we mention a crisis, we have confidence, resilience, optimism. We can see the trend here. I just want to remind everyone, all our participants, that you can ask questions to the panel directly in the Q&A section. Please do so, and I will take those questions to our illustrious guests today. Mr. Rutledge, I would like to turn to you at the moment. So we've heard different scenarios and cases since the beginning of our discussion. And from your perspective as a lawyer, I'm interested to know, what can you tell us on the impact that COVID-19 has had on contractual relations between the various stakeholders, and also if there are any lessons that can be learned from what is happening at the moment. And here I just would like to tag Mrs. Mumbengegui, who was looking forward to hearing what you had to say.
Absolutely, and thank you very much. And thank you to Harry Perry from ALSF for setting the broad brush picture. I think, and we'll just look at some of the legal dynamics in a little bit more detail and see how the pandemic has played across the contractual matrix. But the basic position, obviously one of turbulence from all angles. The pandemic has had an impact on many parties' ability to comply with their contractual obligations, and I guess from the legal perspective, the first body of issues really center around this question of force majeure across the contractual matrix. So really, the question is, regardless of whether your contract specifies the epidemic or a pandemic as falling specifically within the concept of force majeure, it's really a question of whether the underlying characteristics of the principle are satisfied as to whether you do actually have a good case for force majeure in order to avoid penalties for failure to perform the contract. So really, regardless of whether we're talking about a common law or a civil law jurisdiction, generally these concepts get contractualized in a similar manner. So we're looking at satisfying characteristics of the event being an external event, preventing performance, and being beyond the parties' control and incapable of remedy by the relevant parties. So if we look at how this all started, the supply chain issue started to pop up on the radar at the very beginning of the year. Obviously, China was impacted, China being one of the main component and equipment suppliers for a great deal of electricity components in the African power sector, not just solar, also panning out to wind and thermal plants. But basically, this impact on the supply chain, coupled with logistical delays as borders got shut, started setting alarm bells ringing with construction programs. So the contractors were feeling very, very rapidly the risk of overruns in terms of timing, and started to issue force majeure notices in order to escape the liability of paying delay damages. How did that pan through then into the contractual matrix? Project companies were obviously then obliged to do the same in terms of their relations with the buyers under PPAs, and also the concession grantor under concession agreements. So again, force majeure notices were signed, were delivered. Looking at the off-takers, as Harry Perry mentioned, this question of take or pay and the impact of reduced demand really became a very, very sensitive one. It was a sensitive one before the pandemic, because in a lot of countries, the profile of demand evolved in such a way that many states found themselves in a position where the anticipated demand was no longer required, and felt it somehow unfair that they would be required to pay for demand that was not actually off-taken. So that was always a sensitive issue, and really increased radically by the advent of the pandemic. Obviously, funds were short and needed to be diverted to needy causes rather than paying for electricity not off-taken. But there have been obviously there's great potential for disputes in that arena, but there have also been some interesting resolutions on an amicable basis of these kind of issues. Very interesting, just talking to my colleagues across the various compass points in Casablanca, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Abidjan. And there were one or two interesting anecdotes there of buyers serving notice of force majeure, or requesting that their purchase obligations be reduced, and in some circumstances, notwithstanding what the contract said, the producers have actually accepted some significant reduction in the payment obligations. I think you mentioned as well lessons for the future. The ones that pop up immediately, this concentration on one or two exporting countries for spare parts and components. It's really something that bears a lot of further consideration. I'm thinking in particular about how tenders can actually be framed in such a way that they encourage domestic production, that they encourage the emergence of a form of industrialization for certain units. And I think this is something we saw very early on in Morocco, as renewables became a very, very important part of the energy mix. And I think that's something that obviously should be considered going forwards across sub-Saharan Africa. The other stress factors, Romain pointed on these before, that there is likely to be, as this pandemic shakes down, there's likely to be need for some form of financial support to the sector. I think that is something that is already emerging. There have been a number of industry polls, and players are pinpointing the need for financial support and also tax breaks and so on. So a proper framework that would be able to support the sector.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ratledge. And now I would like us to take a closer look at experience on the ground with our next guest. I now turn to Mr. Yassine Kerouchi, International Sales Director at Fonroche Lighting, which is a major industrial player in the field of solar street lighting with a strong foothold in Africa. Mr. Kerouchi, be welcome.
Hi, thank you, Anne-Marie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you for being with us today. Mr. Kiruchi, Fond Roche,
Kerumi.
Yes, Kerumi.
Yes,
sorry.
it's okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So your company, Fond Roche Lighting, has operations in about 15 countries across Africa and more than 49 countries worldwide. And preparing this webinar, you mentioned that the impact of the health crisis has been very different depending on the region. Can you please explain to us where those differences occurred and why?
Well, we're in the business of deploying solar street lighting solutions worldwide. So COVID as such, like as a virus, did not have any impact on our activities. What actually had an impact was the lockdown, and more specifically, the scale of the lockdown, the level of this lockdown that went from moderate to strict in different regions around the world. When you look at regions like West Africa or Central Africa, you only have to go back in time about 10 years to find the last lethal widespread epidemic that was namely the Ebola crisis. So therefore, there is a recent experience in dealing with these kind of situations, which led to a more moderate approach and a more case-by-case approach to the lockdown. On the other hand side, when you go to North Africa or Europe, you have to go back in time at least 50 years to find something as widespread and as lethal as what we've seen during the COVID. And as far as we are concerned, we clearly saw a correlation between the level of lockdown and the impact on our activity.
Thank you very much. And so what are the exact consequences of your activities on the ground, whether it's Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa? Can you give us even more detailed examples?
Yes, of course. 2 years ago, we were awarded the world's largest solar street lighting contract in the world. That was 50,000 solar streetlights to light up 30% of Senegal, of the national territory. So to light up streets, roads, urban, rural. We started executing this project 18 months ago. We started at a pace of about 15 kilometers per week, which means that every week we were lighting up 15 kilometers of road. After a little while, we went to 20, then 25, then 30, then came COVID. So we expected this pace of deployment to slow down. But actually what happened is exactly the opposite. We went up to 35, 40, 50, up to 60 kilometers of road lit per week during the COVID crisis. And this actually was possible because Senegalese officials recognized and considered that access to energy and access to light is a basic need. And therefore, we could benefit from a waiver that allowed us to continue hiring and continue executing our project on the field as long as we were respecting all the health and safety measures. So we continued working very fast. And at the moment, we're ahead of schedule, and we didn't have not even one case of COVID in our local operations. On the other hand side, if we look at North Africa, where we also had projects that we were executing, well, we had to stop because the COVID was, the lockdown, sorry, was much more strict. And all we could do was webinars and keep in touch with our clients. Which was great, but I would say the impact of webinars on the short-term business is moderate.
Thank you very much. And so in the long term, how do you see your activities emerging from this crisis?
Well, funny enough, this quarter, let's call it the COVID quarter, so that the second quarter of the year was the best quarter in our history. We invoiced more than 30 million euros in the second quarter of this year, while the whole of last year, our revenue was about 30 million. So we're quite fortunate to be in a position that our order book is full. We also started executing a second major contract for us, which is in Benin. Benin awarded us a project to light up 9 cities. This is something we're doing now, and we're finalizing by February next year. So I would say that's super positive. It's a 22 million euros contract. As we're speaking, I mean, now as you can see, I'm at home talking to you, but as we're speaking, we have about 12 meetings ongoing right now in 12 different countries around the world. This is because last year we opened local subsidiaries everywhere. We only hired locals, which means that we can continue to operate without even being able to travel. Our teams are still based locally, are still working and developing business. And yes, I would say the outcome is positive. We're hiring. However, we think that there is definitely going to be an impact on the public sector, and there is going to be more pressure on governments' budgets. So we're also launching new business models so that governments could deploy solar street lighting at a very large scale, but without impacting their budget on short term. So I would say the mix of innovative business models, global foothold with local presence, and the strong order book makes us very positive about the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kehumi. So I got it right this time, and I beg your pardon about earlier on. And we can definitely see an interesting trend emerging. You are very positive as well. Thank you very much for your contribution today. And now time for the result of our first survey. You'll see that in a second on your screen. Let's see how you voted. I repeat the question. Do you fear that the pace of electric projects in Africa could be lastly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis? Yes, very much. Yes, a little actually wins the day. Not that very much, 23%, and not at all, 3%. And now time for the second survey. You will see that in a second as well. And again, I would ask you to contribute. The question is, when do you think 99% of Africans will have access to electricity? And there is a timeline. Please vote. We'll be delighted and very interested in your answers. And I'll give that in a few minutes. So time now for the second part of our discussion. So of course, because of the pandemic, priorities on the continent may have changed and shifted. Food insecurity for sure has come back as a main concern in the months to come, and healthcare systems have eventually appeared as a major challenge to take up for heads of states. So it's fair to wonder whether electricity is still a priority for governments and investors in the midst of this pandemic. And what we've just heard suggested that in Senegal, for instance, they are still taking it as a priority. So I would like for this second part of the discussion to start with you, Mrs. Ogunbiyi. Mrs. Ogunbiyi, one of the main objectives of your organization, C for All, is to achieve universal access to electricity by 2030, which I have to remind everyone that is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 7 to be precise. So do you believe that this goal is now threatened by this pandemic?
Again, I feel like there were a lot of issues even before the pandemic. I mean, it's my job to be optimistic about 2030, and I really believe that is possible. All the things you mentioned, health systems, agricultural food chains, they all can't be sustainable without electricity. And I feel that link with electricity is sometimes forgotten. It's the only one SDG that if it's not sufficient, none of the other SDGs will actually be achieved. And I think that's what everybody's talking about now. So you can fund ventilators, but ventilators need electricity. You even when a vaccine is ready, the cold chains to get the vaccines to the people that need it would need some form of electricity. And I think that's what's coming out from this, right? It is shown that electricity and energy is really the heartbeat of everything we do. So for me, again, don't waste a good crisis. It's just to emphasize that issue as well. And so what you're finding is that people are putting money into health, putting money into agriculture, putting money into the economy, but they're putting money also to powering systems for health, powering systems for agriculture. So it's not good enough to just see the budget for agriculture, budget for health, and not think that there's something about electrification within those budgets. I think that's what's been happening. There's a lot of talk going on. And again, I'm just really encouraged by African governments really stepping up. I think Africa has done a lot better than, touch wood, than a lot of countries around the world who have a lot more resources during this type of pandemic. And I think we shouldn't forget about that. I know this whole panel is about challenges and challenges. But when we have done well, I think we should also applaud ourselves. The truth is a lot more can be done. The momentum to do it needs to be put back again. There needs to be an investment in indigenous companies and indigenous contractors also doing work and complementing the international people that come ahead, which is something that I've always been passionate with when I was in Nigeria and in my new role as well. Because the truth is, they're the ones who stuck around during COVID, you know, when everybody flew away, and those are the ones that are still on ground now. So I think kind of marrying kind of indigenous and international, and also holding DFIs accountable and financing. I think this is a point that we haven't actually spoke about. It's torture to get climate financing. It is horrendous to try and get DFI financing. I had to do it in my previous role, and even till date, the largest energy access program is 550 million. That's nothing, because it's a $40 billion a year industry that we're trying to solve. So I think it's not just about it's about strong policies and direction, but it's not only about holding kind of African countries accountable. We also have to hold a lot of global players accountable that say that they do want to help Africa and they want to progress in this, but how long will it take them to actually get there? If we're negotiating grants and funding that takes on average 2 to 5 years, then no, we're not going to achieve 2030. So I think just the new way of thinking, new commitments, and us all coming to the table and say commercial, not commercial, aid, support, everyone coming together and saying that we want to resolve this issue is what's needed at this time. And I can see a lot of it happening right now in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. P, I would like to have your opinion on this matter. What is your opinion? Do you think that electrification will remain a priority for governments and development banks?
I like the fighting spirit of Damilola. I think, you know, one of the dangers sometimes is to look at it from too high up. And you know, I think we've seen some countries doing really well, but we're seeing also starting some bad decision being made. And I think that's why sometimes I think we mentioned government, but currently I just give you Kenya as a country. You know, and I will come back on. Kenya has been leading really the way in the off-grid sector. Again, what we have seen, for example, on the north side is this park curfew and travel restriction. We are around 20% ahead of budget in terms of sales, in terms of performance. Now, Kenya public finances are being significantly impacted by COVID. So they spent two measures. The first one, they're increasing VAT. And the second piece is the VAT exemption, which we're benefiting for solar home systems, is going to be removed. You can see the impact on the systems, but that's not been thought through. One of the fastest growing sectors in the energy space in Kenya is solar powered irrigation systems, water irrigation systems. Again, that will be impacted because the solar panels are going to be taxed around 18 to 20% higher. And that will have an impact on demand. So I think there is generally a broad commitment towards the access to energy. I think what we've seen on the other end is, I think access to energy is very confusing to a lot of people, especially when they're based in Europe. They think access to energy is giving everyone power, okay, which is very different. And they do not understand the power needs of people. If you need power to charge one mobile phone and 3 lights, the $500 or $1,000 transmission line is just not going to help you connection cost, okay? And what is maybe more required is clean cooking. It remains a challenge across the continent. We're seeing still charcoal and wood being the primary cooking fuels. And I think there's been solution that people have been very, especially we've seen Dfis or public sector being very dogmatic. And for example, LPG, you know, we've seen in Morocco, LPG penetration has massively reduced the amount of deforestation, the amount of coal consuming by the population to cook and to heat. But that's not translated in other countries. So I think that's something where we've seen that. I think I totally agree with you, Damilola. We've seen, you know, decentralized power solutions. So really 21st century coming there. The public sectors has not kept change with these changes. You know, they're just a bit behind. We've seen some countries leading the way, Togo, Kenya, but the rest, they're a bit struggling. And I think, you know, they've been, in a sense, an amount of education and support in fact, what is the solution? And sometimes the solution is a mix of on-grid, a bit of mini-grid, and a bit of off-grid. And there is not one solution. You need to have complementary solution. But we are not necessarily seeing this level of engagement across the country. Or for example, we've seen in some Central African country, a lot of money put by the World Bank to electrification are currently sitting in bank account for the last 3 years because the government was not unable to put together a program. All the producers and the private sector did provide a lot of commentary, and everyone was unique, but they just, for whatever reason, this kind of these comments were not taken in consideration. And at the end, you have a lot of money, capital sitting there. I think that if you want to solve a crisis, you need innovation and you need people moving fast.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. I would like to turn to Mr. Rutledge. I'd like to have your opinion, actually. According to you, how have governments and Dfis reacted to the crisis? And what is the prognosis in terms of new tenders and programs?
Thanks. Yeah, just just to follow on from Damilolo and Romain there. I mean, certainly it's clear that you can't do enough given the chronic energy access deficit. That there is not enough that can be done ever in terms of connecting people up to reliable sources of electricity. That said, I think that there have been over the last couple of months some green shoots. I mean, there's been evidence certainly that governments and Dfis are doing their bit to step up to the mark and are not completely taking their eye off the ball. I mean, I think there have been a number of interesting tenders that are coming out more obviously in the centralized energy space. We've seen, as Romain mentioned, there've been some good performance from countries like Togo and Kenya. Togo pre-qualifying bidders for its scaling solar program. Kenya moving forwards finally with Olkaria 6. Gas-fired plants being pre-qualified in Cameroon. Zimbabwe, we're looking at a 500 megawatt, very ambitious solar program there coming out. Not quite as ambitious as the Algerian 4 gigawatt Tafuki solar program, but that is also now coming back on the radar, and people are hopeful that will take shape at some stage. A lot of activity also in Egypt, expressions of interest requested for waste to energy projects as well. Looking at the Dfis, again, I mean, there have been some evidence of people wanting to step up the speed of implementation of a number of programs. I'm thinking in particularly about AFDB wanting to speed up the Desert to Power initiative there, which is designed to turn the Sahel region into the world's largest solar power zone with 10,000 megawatts of power. There are also some interesting strategy papers coming out of AFDB as well in relation to Nigeria promoting growth of clean power and also transmission and distribution projects. More activity as well, AFDB supporting Egypt electricity, green growth support programs. IFC, obviously a perennial player in this space, showing signs of wanting to team up as well across the globe with financing partners like JBIC to reach out to the more fragile and conflict affected states. IFC again building out its program scaling solar in new countries like Togo and RCI, Ivory Cote d'Ivoire. So that's just really a snapshot of the kind of DFI activity we've seen. So I think the prognosis is, I'd say it's cautiously positive. Obviously, there's a lot of ground to catch up, but things appear to be moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. So I now turn to Mrs. Omogiafo for the last part of our second part of the discussion. Mr. P mentioned the World Bank, and indeed, the World Bank announced a €3 billion 8-year benchmark to support programs in member countries on April the 16th this year. So do you feel a big part of it will serve electrification in Africa? And also, do you think that Transcorp could access this in any way?
So a lot has been said about the funding, the opportunities, and I like what Damilolo has said about looking at the opportunities that are inherent in all of this. And yes, the World Bank, the announcement on April 16th, as we've seen, is being followed through. I mentioned earlier, just yesterday or the day before, the World Bank has indeed backed this, and Nigeria is a beneficiary of $750 million. That is for the power sector recovery program for Nigeria. So looking at that, it's clearly one of those things that's coming in. And the Nigerian government, I must reiterate, in the past year, actually during the COVID-19, what's going on right now, we've actually taken very strong strides. The power sector was declared as essential services, so we continued working, by the way. We continued even during the lockdown because power is so critical. Power is going to drive everything, as from the ventilators, the online education, everything that we move to online. The webinar we're having right now, without power, we're not going to do it. So power in one way or another. And with that renewed focus, the federal government has provided a lot of support in this period. We are accessing funds. Transcorp in particular, we're very encouraged by the Siemens deal that the federal government of Nigeria has gone into. Because if you understand how the power sector in Nigeria has gone, how it's evolved, some years back, the power sector was completely government managed. Then we went through a privatization process that saw the emergence of three key players in the sector: the generating companies, the transmission companies, and the distribution companies. So for us who generate, part of the challenges we've had is actually offtake, the evacuation of what we've generated. So looking at the Siemens deal, it's very encouraging to us because it shows that we can have better offtake of what we are producing. So automatically we are benefiting from that. So in the next few years, there's a three-phase strategy of, say, moving from 5 gigawatts or the gig to for the grid, from 5 gigawatts to 7 gigawatts in the first instance, moving from 7 to 11, and then the real game changer, moving from 11 to 25 gigawatts of capacity to take the power to the end user. So this is really critical. And looking at what's coming into the country, there's been the payment assurance plans as well that Transcorp has benefited from, as well as when these improvements are in place, the distribution companies will be in a better place to collect the money. And with the transparency and all the metering and the technology that's been put in place that will drive further transparency in the sector, it will be clear who is doing what, where the money is, and how it's going to come back to us, which will address some critical challenges that we face today in the sector. But to say for us in Transcorp, we're all about opportunity. We could sit down and really talk about the challenges, but we're also recognizing the opportunity. One critical opportunity that has emerged in Nigeria on this is taking a look at the residential. Because as you said earlier on, we focused a lot, there's a lot of power demand from the commercial, and that had been the focus. But during this lockdown, we've realized that there's also quite a significant usage from residential, and there's been a lot of focus and discussion around driving that as well. So we are looking to see how more inflow is going to come into Nigeria. You can't discuss Africa's development without looking at Nigeria. This is the plain truth. You cannot, right? And as we're getting more of the Dfis, I love what all the previous speakers have said, and we are here as viable partners because we've shown that indeed it is doable. We took from 160 megawatts to 680 megawatts in 5 years. And we are really committed to improving lives and transforming Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it is indeed worth mentioning that you won last year a bid for a power plant, which is gas fueled. And this energy really appears to be very promising in Africa. Firstly, because the continent, of course, has this in abundance. And because also many suggest that this source of energy is perfect for transition from high to low carbon electricity. And this is precisely the reason why we are going to take a closer look at gas to power projects right now, as it seems indeed essential for now more than ever, really, for our states to capitalize on those untapped reserves. And to discuss this, I leave the floor to Duncan Williams, Senior Counsel at Acfta & Co. Mr. Williams is an American lawyer based in France with over 15 years of experience working with listed companies in Europe and in North America. Mr. Williams, Welcome.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Nice to be here. Hi, everyone. Yes, so let's jump right into this discussion about gas in Africa. And in particular, we're going to talk about integrated gas power projects, and as well as a few different technologies and different aspects of the market. So here, let's go to the first slide. And this is an interesting, it complements in an interesting way with the first slide of Harbari's presentation at the beginning of this webinar. This slide is a spotlight on sub-Saharan Africa. The first presentation included North Africa, and we saw there that natural gas was the dominant power source, or the majority power source for electricity generation in Africa. Whereas here, if you just look at sub-Saharan Africa, coal is 54%, more than 54% of electricity generation in sub-Saharan Africa. If you take out South Africa, that number comes down quite a bit because South Africa produces about 90% of its electricity through coal. But here you see today that natural gas is only 11.5% of power generation in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the lowest level in any continent in the world. Obviously, renewables are the solution that we're moving towards in the future, and that everyone hopes that we'll use less and less carbon-based sources for electricity generation in the coming decades. In fact, the title of this slide should be "Natural Gas: Part of the Future of African Power Generation." But in the short term, there's a huge potential for Africa to switch to natural gas sources for many reasons, as a way to reduce carbon in the very near term. In particular, there's been gas discoveries in over 20 African countries. Roughly close to half of African countries have natural gas resources. And a whopping 40% of gas discoveries around the Earth in the past 20 years have been in Africa, including the massive discoveries in Mozambique, the large discoveries in Tanzania, Senegal, Mauritania, and most recently in South Africa. And just to note, today, Nigeria and Angola are actually exporting LNG. So they're exporting their gas around the world. And projects in Mozambique, Egypt, Senegal, and Mauritania are expected to reach exporting within this decade. And those projects, unfortunately, will be likely delayed by the COVID crisis, in part due to the supply chain issues that we've talked about already today. So on the next slide, we can see one of the reasons why natural gas is part of the energy mix, or the solutions for Africa going forward. You can see the price today has gone down to below where it was in the late 1990s. The price for natural gas. This is the Henry Hub natural gas price in the United States, but this price gets reflected kind of all around the world. And what we're seeing is that since the financial crisis of 08-09, the natural gas price has been trending down, basically for more than 10 years. So that allows us to take advantage of importing into countries that don't have gas, and also allows for a lot of different allows for projects, especially big projects, integrated gas to power projects, to become more viable. Now, when we talk about integrated gas to power projects, we're talking about very large projects where, in particular, different players come together to create a project in different aspects of the value chain. And what that does, or what the hope there is, that it's going to create bigger demand, bigger supply and bigger demand, and that larger scale demand allows for better bankability, allows for better access to international financing from Dfis and also private sources. And it's, these are pretty complicated large projects. There are a few around the world that have come online, notably in Indonesia and Chile, that can serve as models for African projects. We'll talk in a minute about some of the projects that have been discussed and vetted for Africa in particular. But these projects in other countries can serve as a model going forward. So on the next slide, we'll go into a little more detail on that. So an integrated gas to power project is basically a vertical integration between the gas producer or the LNG importer, participating together in the same sort of capital structure or otherwise with power producers, project developers, and other parties to bring the gas in and deliver it to electricity plants, also to end users, even in some cases, mining projects, et cetera. And what this does is this helps avoid a lot of regulatory and planning problems by eliminating, let's say, a gas aggregator that comes in the middle of the process and maybe has bankability problems, therefore giving guarantee problems for the financing, et cetera. So this structure allows us to move beyond some of those complicating factors. And here on this slide, we've also just got a snapshot of a few key African countries, sub-Saharan countries, with their projected gas-fired power demand through 2030. You can see, as we talked about here today, Nigeria is obviously the biggest market for electricity in Africa, and in particular, gas-powered electricity, given the massive gas reserves in Nigeria. South Africa also projected to have a very large gas-powered electricity supply by the end of the decade, in part thanks to big discoveries there as well, but also for the huge need and the need to reduce coal. So moving to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the big gas power projects that have been discussed and vetted or planned over recent years. Again, in South Africa today, they're producing 90% of their power from burning coal, which is obviously a major CO2 problem. South Africa's project was vetted to produce 6,000 megawatts from a combined cycle gas turbines by the end of the decade. That's a very big, ambitious project. Also in Namibia, a very ambitious Kudu project that would be the largest combined cycle gas turbine of its size in sub-Saharan Africa. These projects are very, very ambitious, very large, very complicated projects, as is Jorf Lasfar in Morocco, which has been announced and discussed for many years, and was originally planned to come online by 2025 to generate 2,400 megawatts. Our understanding is that that's been reduced somewhat, down with as well as the anticipated cost, which was originally like $4.5 billion, I think. Very big project. But those ambitions are getting slightly downsized, not necessarily due to COVID, but just due to different market factors that make these projects complicated to put into place. It's not on the slide, but I would mention other projects that aren't necessarily what we'd consider to be integrated gas to power projects. But for example, OCTP in Ghana, where Eni is the operator of an offshore field, and it's the first gas field, unassociated gas field in Africa that's been developed exclusively for the domestic market. And the gas from that project is being shipped onshore to Ghana to run electricity plants in Ghana. And it's a very exciting step in the development of African gas, because it's the first gas project dedicated only to Africa of its size and for not for export. So we'll turn to the next slide, which talks a little bit about a few other interesting technological sort of developments in the gas space that can create other opportunities on a smaller scale for using gas in Africa efficiently and economically. And the first is obviously floating storage and regasification units, which make importing LNG much more cost effective as opposed to a regasification plant on land. And there are a lot of projects that we're seeing. We're working on a couple of projects where companies want to bring these ships to the Gulf of Guinea in particular to allow allow gas importation into countries that don't have large supplies of gas, or even countries where there is gas, but it's too expensive to build a pipeline from where the gas is to where the mining projects are, for example, or for where the gas, the power demand is. And what we've seen is that if you bring LNG to a country through import projects, that can help get off the ground a lot of mining projects. Obviously, mining projects require a lot of power, and there are many projects around Africa, as well as cement plants and other energy-hungry industries that are desperate for power, and there's not enough power in the region. So these LNG importation projects can help get those mining projects off the ground, and the mining projects can then serve as an anchor off-taker for the LNG import. And finally, I'd like to mention, as a complement to LNG import, but also as a way to get a local market going for small amounts of gas, small-scale LNG and compressed natural gas are fantastic technologies that are being used all around the world today, creating what they call the virtual pipeline, where you have an LNG unit that's the size of a ship container that can be put on a truck bed and sent to a small gas field, and then you don't have to build a pipeline. The capex costs are much lower than building pipelines or high tension wires. And as long as you have roads, or it can also be barged, the gas can be brought to market and where the users need it at a much cheaper way. And what we've seen around the world, particularly in the Bacon Shale in North Dakota or in other large gas producing regions, is everybody switches to natural gas once the solution is available. Drilling rigs, for example, stop using diesel, people with generators, etc. So it's an interesting technology that we hope we'll see in Africa very soon. So that's it for me. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. So before moving to our next segment, I would like you to see the results of the second survey. You'll have that on your screen very shortly. And let's see how you reply. So the question was, when do you think 99% of Africans will have access to electricity? Around 2050 or after 2055, that's the majority. Around 2030, 12%, 2040, 19%. Are these results surprising? Do we have a reaction from our panelists? Anyone would like to comment at all? All right, we'll move ahead then. So I just have a couple of questions rapidly before moving to our Q&A answers. So one question that remains, you would have understood really, is whether the power mix on the continent will shift as a result of this crisis. And I'll go straight to you, Mrs. Ogunbiyi. I know that you have other appointments, so you might leave us early. So my question is, over the last decade, renewable energies have been steadily increasing in the energy mix of African countries. According to you, will this trend continue and even be reinforced by the crisis?
I think this trend will continue, and I think it would be reinforced as well. Like was said earlier, it's really important to understand energy demand and what people actually need. And I think data plays a big role in how energy evolves in Africa now. So developing proper least cost electrification plans that take in consideration mini grids, off-grid, interconnected mini grids, as well as the grid, is also really important to find what is the least cost way of electrifying people. In most cases, in terms of, let's say, in terms of the 565 million that currently are not electrified in Africa, you probably find out that 70% of these people can actually be powered either interconnected or off-grid. And that's really, really significant. But that's with the data playing. And I think the fact that governments are going to be trying to save money now and actually be putting their money in key places that shows results, it's also going to be panned out that way. However, I don't want people to think that because you're having off-grid solutions, it means that it is just a charger and a couple of light bulbs. I do believe in off-grid solutions that actually bring some kind of economic growth story as well. So to be used economically, not just within the household. And the results we're getting in West Africa is people are actually saying that they prefer power to be where they work than where they live. And that's a trend that we haven't seen before. So people are saying, I make money or I spend 16 hours of my day where I work. If you can give me power there, I can sort out my house. So that's where the data comes in. And we really, really need to listen to the people and the public that are going to utilize the power. So I think this is the time, I think this is the renewables revolution for Africa. And I think everybody plays a key role. And I'm really happy with Transcorp as well, who have also tried to play a role in mini grid and off grid, as well as utility. I think we're going to find a lot of that with companies trying to do on and off grid and understanding the dynamics around it to actually get to universal access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so I naturally turn to you, Mrs. Omogiafo. Is Transcorp interested in renewable projects? Are you incentivized to invest further in those? And do you have any projects in the months ahead?
So thank you, and thank you to Damilola. We appreciate your recognition of what we're doing in the power sector. So Anne-Marie, like I said earlier, our purpose in Transcorp is improving lives, transforming Nigeria, and that's what has led us into power. As Damilola just said, we're guided by data. Okay, we're very focused on improving the access to power across the country, and naturally, a combination of renewable energy is going to come into play. But it's also important to understand what data tells us about Nigeria. So whilst we're looking at that, it's also important to note that the energy, whatever strategy we take, has to be sustainable and at the same time affordable, because you need a system that is self-sustaining and the end user is in there. But as for Transcorp, the answer is yes, we are looking at that space, but it has to be done in a manner that's going to be affordable for the end user and it's sustainable for us as a company to ensure that it does deliver. Incentives, I mean, generally, everyone likes incentives. There are incentives in there. So having partnerships, very strategic partnerships that can let us look at how do we use renewable energy to drive off-grid access. But even beyond off-grid access, we do have nations in the world that are on total on-grid with renewable. So could that be the thing for us as well in Africa? And Transcorp, we have an enviable position because we do have an oil and gas asset that we're looking at. Okay, can we do a gas to power thing? So hearing Duncan Williams speak earlier on about a virtual pipeline is really, really interesting to hear because the power sector is hugely capital intensive. So renewable energy is definitely going to be one of the ways going forward, subject to what I said before. But we also need to keep in mind that in Africa, or let me even limit myself to Nigeria, significant investment has been made in the power sector on the existing inputs that produces the power that we have. But with the right incentive, the right investment from the Dfis, but you need patient capital to drive a power deal forward, we certainly will be looking to do that.
Thank you very much. So we are almost at the end of our discussion. There's about 10 minutes left. And I quickly want to take to you a couple of questions sent by our participants. The first one is, how can the Acfta spur the growth of the energy sector? And this question is sent by Marlon Burgess, CEO of AfriSky Holdings. Anyone would like to answer this question? Maybe Mrs. Ogunbiyi, would you like to answer this question? Oh, you have to leave us. Yes. So I would like to thank you.
I'm so sorry. I have to leave right now to another webinar. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all my other panelists. We see you again, and we try and work on some projects together.
Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. So I would like to ask maybe Mr. P, if you would like to answer this question.
I think, given the large number of landlocked countries, he has to be part of the solution, because this country whatever they need in terms of energy or spare parts or piece of equipment, will need to import them through a number of African borders. So it will help. I think I will caution just maybe the size of the impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And we have another question. This is from Caleb Dengu, chairman of Rio Energy, and he's asking how to get Dfis to underwrite country risk on power projects. Maybe Mr. Ratledge, would you like to answer Mr. Dengu?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? It was how to get Dfis to underwrite.
That's right. Country risk on power projects.
I mean, there are a number of financial instruments that are already in place to cover political risk. Obviously, there are key players in this market like AFDB, IFC, and MIGA. So the range of instruments available really cover a whole spectrum of debt and equity instruments. They're available. They're available at a cost, and they're also available. I think we can't deny that they take a bit of structuring. They take a bit of time to put in place, and they also require, for most of them, I'm thinking in particular about partial risk guarantees. They require certain specific instruments like an indemnity agreement with the host country. So they're available, and they certainly, if they're required to enhance the bankability of a project or the feasibility of a project, they should be addressed right at the front of the development cycle. There are also, I think it's worth mentioning that apart from the Dfis, obviously there are commercially available instruments, but those tend to be available at quite an incremental cost.
Thank you very much. And we have a direct question for you, Mrs. Omogiafo, coming from Alexis Akwi-Begbu. You will excuse me for the accent. So the question is, the 50 million Nigerians you mentioned that do not have access to electricity, will they be able to access it even if the power generated were in excess abundance? And will they be able to afford it at today's rates?
Thank you very much. So if you recall earlier when I talked about Transcorp's purpose of improving lives and transforming Nigeria and how that guides us in our power investment, we talked about it being affordable and sustainable. Yeah. So the issues with the grid right now, there's improvement, but there's significant room for improvement still. And with what the government is doing through the Siemens deal, where they're looking to improve the grid capacity from current 5 gigawatts to 7, then to 11, then to 25, it's an integrated approach that is being put in place to ensure that power is well priced across different things from the residential to commercial usage, and ensuring that all the levers that interplay to deliver power, that they are well incentivized so that the power that is delivered at the end of the day is affordable and is sustainable as well as steady. So in terms of access is going to improve with this improvement on the grid. And when that improves, you're also going to get better offtake from us. And there are some carry costs that we have right now that would be greatly reduced when we see these overall improvements in the sector.
Thank you very much for your answer, which was very clear. Thank you very much. So I would like to thank you all to have taken part to our discussion, and also to have a close look at your screen, because very soon you will have the details of our next webinar. And I would like to remind you that very shortly you will also have a replay of today's webinar. So here are the next theme: post-COVID logistics in Africa, taking up challenges and seizing opportunities, which will take place on Thursday, the 2nd of July. Also, you will be able to see past webinars on the Africa CEO forums, and indeed register for the next ones to come. You'll also receive in your emails a survey to let us know what you thought about this webinar. And like I've said many times throughout our discussions today, your opinion is very dear to us. I would like to thank all our speakers today: Simon Ratledge, Owen Omogiafo, Roman P, as well as Yassine Kerumi, Damilola Ogunbiyi, who sadly had to leave us a little bit earlier, and Ahuperi Mumbegegui. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges. I thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon for our next webinar.